Hi, I'm Mina, and this is Sharon.
Hi.
We actually have our 40th anniversary this August, and it is one of activism. These blocks that make up this quilt represent a good part of that 40 years of activism. But I would like to tell you a little bit about how this came into being. You know, everybody collects something. So some people collect owls, some people collect all sorts of different kinds of trivia. And one of the things that we did is we saved our T-shirts. We like to save things, and T-shirts is one of the things we saved. And a few years ago, my friend Shoshana Weston, who's the photographer who took the pictures of our wedding when we got married here a few years ago when we Californians could get married. And she's the daughter and granddaughter of Lesbians. She came over to help me go through stuff because we just had accumulated too much stuff, as so many of us do at this age. And we came upon the T-shirts, and there were just too many of them. My drawers were filled with T-shirts, as were Sharon's. And I just hated to let go of them, and didn't know what to do with all of them, and an awful lot of them either were worn out or didn't fit anymore. Had gotten too small. And she said, well, why don't you make a quilt out of them? And I had never heard of a T-shirt quilt at that point. And she said, yeah, you can have a T-shirt quilt. And I said, well, who does these things? And she said, well, there's people around who do them. And I said, well, I'll have to find one, you know, because I certainly couldn't do it. And she said, okay, well, she said, why don't we go through them and find out the ones you'd like to see in one? And so we got a big plastic garbage bag, and we started putting the ones that we'd like to save and felt worthy of being in a quilt into, and that grew into, I think, 2 huge garbage bags full of T-shirts that we wanted to wash and save. And that went into the garage, and it sat there. And I have a neighbor named Edie Harbor who's here with us today, and she happens to be a quilt maker. And at the time, she was still working at a job, and every so often I'd go across the street and I'd say, Edie, interested in making me a quilt? And she'd say, well, yeah, but I don't have time. And so that kind of went on for a few years. And finally, one day, Edie, who I have to tell you is straight, said, okay, I've retired, I've got time. So that ended up making this quilt. And it was quite an adventure because every so often Edie would say, well, what does this mean and what does that mean? And I don't understand that. So there was an education.
I wasn't sure about the dikes from hell. Dikes from...
What does dikes from hell mean? What?
Should I be involved with this?
And so there was quite an education going on, although we've been neighbors now for 30 years. And, you know, and we're friends, but she didn't know about a lot of this stuff. And so that was nice. So Edie made us this beautiful quilt, and we, you know, decided which blocks would go into it and kind of where they would go in the, you know, on this. And but she picked out all of the borders, and also you didn't get to see the back, which is all pink triangles, which is pretty fabulous. And so that's a very, very nice thing. And that's pretty much about the quilt as a whole. So, and if you're interested in getting your own quilt made, I have some of Edie's cards here and some brochures. So, and she is here with us today, if you have any questions for her after. And we did want to tell you about some of the specific things, blocks in the quilt. And I wanted to talk about historically, because this is a quilt that we lived. We started not exactly in the exact order, but pretty much. And the top, the powder blue up there, that's Sisterhood Bookstore on the top. And I worked there. I worked at Sisterhood Bookstore for 16 years, part-time, from 1979 to 1995. And those were just the heyday of feminist bookstore working. And it was just a most glorious time to be working at a feminist women's bookstore. I cannot tell you the fabulous time I had as a bookstore worker. And it was it was wonderful. I had the honor of being able to give the appropriate books to teenagers who were needing to come out, and getting them the right books to read, and young women coming out, and women of all ages who wanted to read about feminism and all of the other things that we were doing through those years, and as well as being able to let people know where things were happening and what was going on in the community. And it was really as much a community center as it was a place to buy a book. So it was a really wonderful place to be. So that represented that part of my life. And the next block that I wanted to talk about, also on the top, was two over from that, very light. It's actually a lavender color. The second one from the end is the West Coast Old Lesbian Conference and Celebration that took place in April of '87. And I was the conference coordinator for that. And that was, we were in our 40s. We were too young to attend. But you had to be over 60. And it was fabulous. Peg remembers, yes. And it was a wonderful one. That was the first. It was the forerunner of OLAC. It was two conferences before OLAC, Old Lesbians Organizing for Change, was invented. But the women, all the women who became OLAC were there, and that was the very beginnings. And it was an extraordinary conference, and every old lesbian was there, and it was wonderful. So, and then there was the March on Washington in 1993, and they're on the second tier right there, and Sharon and I went to Washington and we marched, and of course with kudos to Cleve Jones, who you'll be hearing from next, we saw the AIDS quilt in its fullest. It was laid out there on the mall, and it was the entire AIDS quilt was there, and we marched, and it was just, I don't know how many of you were also there in '93, but it was an extraordinary experience to be there, to see the AIDS quilt in its entirety, and to experience everyone, and to walk through the streets of Washington and run into people you knew, and to hear the wonderful speeches that were on stage, and it was quite amazing. And let me let Sharon talk for a while.
Okay, well, the next block that I'm supposed to talk about is the one right up here that says GLBSU, because I was involved in that. That's the Cal State University Dominguez Hills, where I taught for 40 years. That was the student union that I organized in the early 70s. And we were very small for many years. Now we're much bigger, and now we're online and we're on Facebook and we're all over the globe. But I remember we took this to the Long Beach Pride Parade back in probably the late 70s. So that was a high for me to see my students, marching with, their sign. I don't know why it doesn't say Dominguez Hills, but I do know that.
You could set it on the back.
Oh, on the back of the T-shirt. Okay. So, and Mina wanted me to talk about the Jewish Feminist Conference that's over there on the 1, 2, 3, 4 down on the first line in black and pink. I remember nothing about that conference, but what I do remember, Mina says it's the only one they ever had in Los Angeles, but I do remember the women who were Jewish feminists in Los Angeles and how I loved working with them, and especially when we worked in the organization called Jews Against Briggs, when we were fighting the Briggs initiative, where they were trying to get rid of school teachers. And of course, being a teacher, that affected me on a personal level. And then if you look right over to the next block over where it says Clause 28, we picked that T-shirt up when we went to England, and they were doing the same thing over there, fighting the Briggs initiative. And not the Briggs initiative, they had their own Clause 28, which was to get rid of gay school teachers, and that passed. However, it was never implemented. So they passed it by vote, and then it was overturned and never implemented politically. I don't remember all the details, but I know it wasn't implemented. And that's because, they were doing the same. We had friends over there in the movement, and we were connecting with them. And so that was a highlight. And then up on the very top left, it says AIDS-thon. It's actually AIDS bike. It was a bike-a-thon. And that represents this organization we were involved in the very early years in the early 80s, 83, 84. It was the AIDS Hospice. Well, the original name was the AIDS Hospice Committee, which became the AIDS Healthcare Foundation later on. And it was a fundraiser. I remember that T-shirt was a fundraiser. I think it says fundraiser on it. That's how I know. And for our AIDS hospice program, which was, we had about 5 hospices in LA in the early days when we were so frightened that, persons with AIDS, particularly the gay men who were getting it in the early days, would be taken care of and have, quality care. And so that, represents kind of the earlier days of the AIDS movement that so many lesbians became involved in, rightly or wrongly. There's been some criticism that, it took away from our own movement, but we were there for the men. And did you talk about OLAC? No, you didn't. Oh, okay. The second one down from the bike-a-thon is an organization both of us are very involved in, Old Lesbians Organizing for Change. And it's a group that fights ageism and lesbophobia. And if you put the two together, we try to make old lesbians more visible in the movement and also just in the world at large. And it's just a wonderful organization because we network with other women over the age of 60 and who are lesbian identified, and we're not afraid of owning the word old. We've turned it around, how other movements have turned words around, like the queer movement turned the word queer around, and it used to be considered, negative, and now it's a positive. Although I have problems with the word queer, but I'm just using it as an analogy. And we've turned the word old around, and we've tried to put the lesbian in the forefront of both words together. And some people are, we have this problem with people with women who, they don't like either word, But especially at, an old, that ones in their 80s, 70s and 80s. Well, we're both 70, but 71, yeah. So, but at this point, what we'd like to do is involve you, because, a lot of these, we don't know what they signify exactly. I do know the worn out one. I could tell you that one is, I think, it's sort of a guess, a hunch, but I think it's, at Sisterhood Bookstore, they used to have this picture of, that I think became a t-shirt that we don't have, of these older black women on a bus, riding on a bus, coming home from working as maids, for white households. And then somehow, I don't know how it got turned, they were worn out. And that's but I could be wrong. That's my interpretation of what I think it means. So I think that represents kind of, well, it's really more feminism than lesbianism, but since both are so important to us, we just put on here what we felt represented us. So now I'd like to know what represents you on there, and what you remember, or what you think, or what you just know. Some of you are young, a lot younger.
If you have any questions.
Or questions, yeah. And also, Edie is over there, the quilt maker. She can answer questions too.